Hi there, it's Marcus here, Marcus Bussey. I'm sitting in Queensland, Australia, and I want to talk to you about futures thinking, how to think out of the box. And we're going to work our way through a series of thought bubbles, which is the way I use PowerPoint, and see where we end up. It's mainly an invitation. That's what I call this particular little lecture. It's an invitation to think out of the box, as I say. So let's get moving. I'm supping on a nice strong coffee, my first for the day, and it's just going to keep me going, keep me awake while I wander through these thoughts with you. So I do have some opening thoughts, okay? And the first one is that futures thinking allows us to explore futures, and this is plural, okay, we would wish for. Optimal futures, inclusive futures that for which a better world is emerging, or from which a better world is emerging. And you know, we're living in particularly dark times. If you're one of those doom scrollers, I would suggest do less of it and act locally in positive and opportunistic ways. You see something somewhere that just suddenly attracts your attention, you think, oh yes, I'm going to actually engage with that. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the very end of this lecture. So what else do I have to say? Well, futures thinking is based on a set of powerful, but I would have to say simple tools that enable us to explore the physical, social, economic, cultural, spiritual, and mysterious shifts that need to occur for our best futures to emerge. There's no guarantee that the futures of conflict and violence that are being sold to us, in buckets at the moment, has any more hold on the future than optimal, positive, and inclusive, just, all the rest of it, and ecological and sustainable, all those wonderful concepts we've been working on for years as a species. There's no reason why they should be pushed to the back just because somebody's trying to start a war somewhere, okay? And we know who we're talking about, right? So it can be playful, I think, exciting and even elegant, but not always, But this does not mean that it can't be clunky or challenging or even overwhelming. And importantly, I think, it is communal and co-creative. We can't future singular on our own. Why? Because all of us carry futures inherent within us, futures that we've been born into. That's, in other words, cultural processes, histories that lead us into the future. And our futures are diverse and varied. Why? Because different parts of the world hold different kinds of future potential. Different people have different intellectual, emotional, spiritual, cultural yearnings that we are seeking to engage with and realize. Oh, it's a rather interesting set of murky possibilities. That's why I often use that word mysterious. It is a word we need to embrace. What's happening on the planet now is mysterious. What we're seeing is people with a kind of intoxication for power and violence and the dominant narratives around identity, reduction, white, patriarchal, middle class or upper class or even working class people, often speaking English, we have to say, but not always. They can be speaking Hebrew or Russian or whatever, Han Chinese, the speaking, I've gone blank. Totally blank, don't worry. But anyway, speaking languages that have been associated with powerful imperialist and controlling and dominating narratives for generations. Okay, so let's move on. So I'm going to offer you now a set of tiles to look at. Not now, we're not going to work our way through all these tiles right now, but over 10 years ago now, I was in Singapore, 2012, 2013, teaching a master's course there at the Nanking University, and I ended up coming up with a kind of summary of the points that I was making with students there. They ended up in an article from which these points are drawn. Okay, concepts and effects, if you want to go and look it up. All right, so, future is a principle of present action. If we see a certain kind of future coming that we anticipate but don't want, we don't want a violent future, what are we going to do? Well, we have to move towards a politics of inclusion. We have to work maybe at the community level, the local level. You could try and write a letter to the president or the prime minister or whoever is, the big cheese in your corner of the world. But, you're going to do something to act. But most importantly, I would say the first act is an act of resistance. We refuse to believe the story of that validates, legitimizes violence, for instance. Okay, and that's the first one. Then the next thing is to stay optimistic, even though it looks like we're going to hell in a handbag. Okay, no, we don't necessarily have to go in that direction. Optimism is a political tool, which means there can always be something better around the corner, but it's a political tool that calls us to action. There is nothing passive about futures thinking, but dominant political thought requires the general population to be passive, whilst those who know better go about, setting the world on fire and then telling us we have to go and sort it out as foot soldiers, rank and file, and so on. The future can be studied by its effects. If we see a certain kind of future coming, it's already in the present. Otherwise we wouldn't be seeing it. And it is there either as a very little weak signal over on the side. Think dinosaurs wandering around thinking that the world was always going to be a world for dinosaurs, when these little furry guys were rushing around in the grasses around the ankles of the dinosaurs, and they were the weak signals of the Jurassic period, for instance. All right, all futures can work is partisan. I say that because it seeks to realize our preferred futures. In other words, as a futurist, I draw on all my academic training, often as a historian, a sociologist, a philosopher of education, and so on. I draw on these things, but I also draw on my broader life experience as a musician and as a poet, as a gardener, as a father and a parent and a partner and all that sort of stuff. All of these things come together, and I bring them into focus in order to realize preferred futures that are secure, for instance, for my descendants, but not just my descendants in that kind of patriarchal, Abrahamic sort of sense, but no, for all inheritors of the planet, birds, trees, organisms, the rocks, the air we breathe, the water we drink, okay, all the species. For me, I have a large kin network of interrelationships, I guess you'd have to put it. And so I got up to number 3, didn't I? So there are 13 there. I will jump to number 13 just because I think it's rather cool. Okay, any useful idea about the future? We can have peace, for instance, on the planet. Must at first appear to be ridiculous. Given what's happening on the planet right now, a world of harmony, peace, a world where economics is not exploitative and extractive, a world where everybody gets a decent meal. These things must seem crazy to a lot of people, okay, but they're not necessarily so. But they do appear to be ridiculous, and that's a good sign. If someone suggests something to you and it seems totally, unrealizable in your dreams, we might say, no, you have to look at and listen and think, hey, how ridiculous is that really? What does it take for us to achieve a goal like that? All right. So one of the things, of course, is that we're seeking to democratize. I am personally, but I think many of us aspirationally are seeking to democratize the future. We want the future to be inclusive, and so on. Now, if you're studying the course at Uppsala University on governance and so on, you're looking at ways of shaping policy, public opinion, engaging with people who deliver services to people in need and so on. You know, we need to be aware that our role actually is one in shaping assumptions, aspirations, directing energy, in terms of money and services and so on, in ways that will hopefully benefit people. So, what's then to be said about that? I gave you 13 first principles. So these first principles structure both reflection and practice and generate an open and dynamic space for cultural evolution and social learning. Okay, cultural evolution. Culture is always evolving. It is as alive as the grass and the mycelia in the earth and everything else. It's alive because we as human beings generate culture just like mycelia generates fungi, okay? And of course, as our fungi grow and reach out towards the sky or whatever it might be, we need to learn, and that learning is what I'm calling social learning, okay? Historically, and this goes back to 2006 and 2007 with David and Joanna Macy, may she rest in peace, that we are in a time of waking up, in which self-consciousness, we're becoming aware, more aware as individuals, but also as a species, no longer privilege that small elite that sit up the top there. The future acts as an attractor in this process and demands attention in a way that it did not in pre-modernity. Okay? In this sense, the future has been a luxury of the affluent, yet it is becoming an increasingly distributed open access zone for reflection and acting in ways that empower from the grassroots up. And I'm a great believer in the grassroots because that's where human creativity, human action, agency get best expressed. Can you hear that? I'll just let that finish singing before I move on. Okay, so what I'm saying then, let's move from being a provocateur, hey you, what about doing this, to an evocateur. Let's get in there and start doing it ourselves. So from a lovely article from Ivana Milojevic and Suhail Inayatullah, two of the superstars of the futures world, I would have to say. You know, they're offering this idea of narrative foresight. In terms of context, narrative foresight straddles, this is important, the boundary between the empirical, the interpretive, the critical, and action learning modes of future studies, all of which are things that different futurists do at different times. It uses the forecasts of the empirical, but recasts them as possible stories, scenarios in other words. That is, unlike the empirical approach of future studies, which sees narratives, qua data, in other words, as accurate and precise descriptions of an objective reality, narrative foresight, in the tradition of interpretive and critical and post-structural studies, sees reality as constantly negotiated by us, the stakeholders. Okay, so if that's the case, let's see. It focuses, this is narrative foresight, on metaphors and myths within the interpretive. Like the critical, it challenges assumptions and interests, but does so to transform or enrich, and this is important, the world view of us, the questioner, not just to disrupt the categories of that which is being questioned. Okay? It enriches. Action emerges, and this is what's key for me, action emerges from this deep questioning of data, meaning, worldview, and metaphor. Narrative foresight as well inquires as to the implications, what if this, then that, of deep narratives, and the relationship of the narratives held by self and other. So, a narrative, as you all know, is a story. It's something we tell ourselves, but it's at a deeply psychological, emotional level. We all live our stories. We are living stories now, and we are being invited always by all sorts of key social participants to enter that world, a world of story, often other people's stories. the craziness, that's happening, let's say, in Iran at the moment, with a potential war on the horizon. Of course, by the time you listen to this, we'll already know something at least of what was going on there. That's initiated by people who have accepted certain narratives, but also who understand that they can sell those narratives to others. Okay, and those narratives often generate the logic or the rationale for a certain kind of action. All right. So, navigating the ruins then. I started using this as a hook, a way of thinking about the future, is that the future is actually a set of ruins that we carry culturally in our heads. Okay? I'm drawing on the work of Garfield Shook, Bell, and there's my own little paper there, Navigating the Ruins of the Future, okay, which came out last year. And there's a live link there, so you can jump straight to it and check it out. It's also in the reading list for this lecture. So here we have a lovely image of a ruin. I took that photo myself when I visited Angkor Wat in Cambodia. But the point for me is that we inhabit ruins, okay? That's what Garfield Shook's making the point there of dwelling within, okay, inhabited ruins of history. But that history has a long arm and it reaches into the future. It replicates itself, not, in a perfect carbon copy, but in a way that generates a certain logic that explains what the hell is going on right now in around the planet, for instance, or what's going on in my own backyard. We have local history and we have global history and everything in between. But for me, we need to understand that those ruins, we actually project them into the future. Okay, and this is what I'm thinking about here. So this is from that short paper that I wrote on Navigating the Ruins. So I'm talking about Garfield Shook's paper. Right? So he offers us something here. He notes that ruins hold promise. The layered nature of the ruin allows several dimensions of reality to partially collapse, one falling into the other, disarticulating their previously sharply drawn lines of demarcation. Just think of that image that I shared of Angkor Wat. So the space enables the emergence of this kind of phenomenon. In its highest amplitude is precisely the inhabited ruin. Okay, so think nationalism, think nation state, think empire. These are ruins that we inhabit today. And to this observation, this is me now, the understanding that the ruins we inhabit, past, present, and future, are all the product of what Teofilo Ruiz, and he's wonderful, calls the terror of history. And he's written a book with that title. In his reading, humanity creates culture in response to a deep sense of aloneness in the universe. Culture is like a coral, that's my analogy, that secretes manifestations of power and purpose and process which it deposits as ruins. Think nation state, think empire, and so on. These are manifestations of the ruins that we project or carry into the future. Here's a great image just to sort of bring the point home. Now I want to turn to things that I get up to, little things. Well, you've already seen the ruins of history, that I like to think and play with metaphor a lot. It helps me think out of the box. It enables my futures thinking, but also enables me to communicate the potential of thinking other. Some people call it a critical imagination. I call it anticipatory imagination. Others call it a moral imagination, and so on. There are many ways of using an adjective to say what kind of imagination are we deploying here. Here's a narrative hack, for instance. This is a little book. It's a free to download. There's a link there. It's from One Day and Tomorrow. Okay, I have a paper in that book, and since this one I've been helping them edit further books. There's a whole stream coming, and they are all wonderful and rich and filled with creative eco-fiction, you might call it, or futures fiction. Some are very short. These ones are coming up to 1,000 words each. So this one was on ecofascism, and it's just a way that, again, I seek to hack, and I use that term deliberately. The narrative hack is a way of hacking our consciousness so that we can start to see potentials within our culture that are hidden or obfuscated by a dominant narrative. Imperialist, white, Christian, powerful stories that seem to shut out alternatives. Of course, everything has benefits, but who benefits? How many? What are the long-term costs of such benefits? One of the points I made in the essay that I gave you before was that there are two kinds of futures. One is open and the other is closed. A closed future is a future that's basically being co-opted by power elites, economic or political or both, or nationalist as well, I guess, but generally they tend to be economic and interested in power and domination. So that's the closed one. The open one are the sorts of futures that I'm probing, the futures that invite us to explore alternatives. So we need to ask serious questions. Whose future are we actually living right now? You can get very personal and say, oh, I became a lawyer or a doctor because my mum and dad wanted me to, but I actually wanted to be a nature guide or a kindergarten teacher or a musician or a poet or whatever, or a gardener, So then you're actually fulfilling the dreams of others, okay? But it can also be that, I'm a consumer. Whose future am I fulfilling? Well, I'm fulfilling the economic elites' visions of a future where we're all good consumers. We stay put, we work hard, we get paid very little for our efforts, and we go out when we're feeling depressed and buy, a car or a toaster or something, okay? So how much choice, really we have to answer is how much choice do we actually have, or do we feel we have? Because for me, sitting side by side with this futures thinking stuff that I'm talking about, there is a futures feeling stuff which is equally, if not more, important in understanding the way we negotiate our own worlds, our own lives, and the choices that we might make. So what I'm looking for here is ways out, escape routes, openness, okay? So alternatives for me mean freedom. Futures thinking offers us a mix of anticipatory critique, strategic orientation, and imaginative process, okay? Drawing on this concept of critique, the goal is to free us. That's what critique does. It gives us a little distance from what's happening around us and invites us in to an alternative way of seeing the world. So this goal is to free us a little from the tyranny of the present, from the conditioning of the present. It is designed to help us see our present as remarkable or even as a surprise, okay? So I'm going to ask you to do something now. I want you to go and grab a pen and paper, all right? We're going to take a deep breath in. I invite you to pause this video for right now. Grab that pen and paper and come back. Okay, I'm assuming you've done that. So I want you to think of an issue that matters to you. It could be, the madness that's happening in the Middle East. It could be the madness that's happening in the Ukraine. Or it could be the madness that's happening in your own community around some issue that's really divisive. I want you to think about that for a moment. And then with your sheet of paper, I want you to divide the paper into 4 stripes across, horizontal rows, 4 rows. In the top row, I want you to write something about this. What do you hear about it in the news and the media? If I open up my phone at the moment and look at the doom scrolling news stuff, I see stuff that's telling me about Australia, my country, and its political response to the attacks on Iran. Apparently our noble Prime Minister thinks it's a good idea. So that's what we're hearing there. Blah, 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 blah. All that sort of news and media stuff. Pause again, then move on. So, second breath. Okay, on the next row down, I want you to write something about who do we look to, like my Prime Minister, in order to fix, blame, or address this matter. That Prime Minister is corrupt. Okay, I want you to think about that, because this is a way of understanding that we live or inhabit political systems, economic systems, and so on. Also social systems like, hospitals and, I'm thinking council, local community politics and so on. Where do we go to in order to address the matter that you nominated? Pause again. Then we move on. In that third row, I want you to then think about this. Now, this is going to be a bit trickier, maybe. What kind of assumptions about the world do we work with, or are we working with here? Are they positive, negative, open, or closed? What kind of assumptions? So I'm thinking, because I dobbed my Prime Minister in at the first one, well, then I'm thinking about certain forms of legitimate power. So I'm thinking about power is somewhere else. That's an assumption. Power is in the hands of people who know more about power than me, prime ministers and politicians and so on. So that's what you're looking for. So if you could write down the things that come to mind about this. This is basically what kind of worldviews do we operate within? Pause. I forgot to say that, didn't I? Now, back to the getting down to the very depths now. So is there a story or a metaphor or a myth that you can link this to? An anchor that sums it all up somehow. This is what Suhail Inayatullah and Ivana Milojevic were talking about with their narrative foresight. Their narrative foresight plumbs the depths of the metaphors we live by. And that's the name of a book from the 1990s. George Lukács and one of his mates, I forget who now. But yeah, what kind of metaphors go with this? So if I think about the Prime Minister again, the metaphor clearly would be something about the strong father, the father who knows best, okay, the father who cares for his white Australian children particularly, and so on. So I can easily say for my little bit that there's a story there that links to the strong father. In other words, patriarchy at work. So what have we been doing here? It's a good question. Let's move on. We've been performing a CLA. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Causal layered analysis. Okay, you'll find it all over the place. One of the little readings that I attached to this course is one by me on causal layered analysis. There are a huge number of publications using CLA, and there are also 3 beautiful volumes edited by Suhail Inayatullah and colleagues that outline the journey of causal layered analysis over more than 30 years now. Okay, so at the top what we've got is litany. That's what I asked you first. So if you look at your own little scribbled notes, what's the situation, the obvious problem, the phenomenon, the trend, the issue? Oh, those Iranians are a bunch of patriarchal people. They like ISIS or whoever, they're killing innocent people. Some of that's true, and some of it's possibly doubtful. So what systems do we have to look? Oh, well, let's look to the US. They're going to go and bomb the hell out of them. Good old the Israelis are going to get in there. So I'm staying with my Iranian thing with my Prime Minister. What's the worldview? The worldview is that naughty children need to be punished. Now, that's my metaphor, actually. I slipped into the lower one. My worldview is that problems are solved through the exercise of legitimate power, globally or locally. That's my worldview. And then down the bottom, what is the myth, the story? What initiative, voice, emotional, and this is really important, experience behind this culture, okay? And that's where my emotional response is that I am pretty powerless, but, I have some power because I can, in Australia, elect a representative to speak for me. And if my representative doesn't get in, then I can complain legitimately for the next 3 to 4 years until, we hopefully get another election. So, moving on, let's unpack this a little bit. So what we do is you just do what I did then. You say, okay, what's happening in the present? Okay, the present is we're bombing Iran. Then the systemic causes of the Iranians are bad because they have an authoritarian, elitist Islamic government. The worldview is that power solves problems, legitimate power solves problems. The myth metaphor is the strong father and I just picked another one earlier, didn't I? The naughty children being the Iranians in this case. Then, what about a different story? And this is where you can transform CLA. So we're going from the top down on one side through to value transformation. That's where we say, aha, what happens if we come up with a story like we are all one human family? That's a humanist story. Or we are one cosmic family, in other words, nature, plants, animals, everything are kindred with me. That's an indigenous or neo-humanist worldview, way of understanding it. And what's the story? We are one family. That's the new myth. If we have we are one family, the worldview changes. It now starts to say, okay, let's work collaboratively. Let's find out why certain governments and certain power structures have been dominating, and let's find out how we can meet those needs in different, more humane, inclusive, just, and blah, blah ways. Then what about the systemic? The systemic gets exciting. We can actually generate new forms of governance, new forms of communication, new forms of community, and so on. And at the litany level, it's a happy ever after story, right? New strategy, measurement, and so on, which, we can be selling through social media or whatever. Whew, that was a very brief and intense little bit, but I hope you hung on there and followed it well enough. Just to flip it a little bit, look at this. This is a triangle on its side, but actually it's a form of the futures cone, where in the center, the narrow beam is the probable. We're most likely going to go to war again. Third World War, as some of my friends keep saying. Then, well, it is plausible that, Trump might sit down with the Iranians and have a cup of tea and say, let's sort this out like gentlemen. What's possible? Anything's possible. It's possible that the Iranians can be given nuclear weapons by, the Russians or someone, because they're mates, and they can toss them back, at people they don't like. That's possible. Not very nice, though. But have you noticed there are different futures, and there are preferable futures? Preferable are the futures that we would like. Okay, and you need to think about that. So this is a visual way of, if you wanted to communicate things to, let's say, people you're working with, your colleagues, your friends, your family, your clients, if you're working in consultancy and so on. And then, of course, there are other ways of looking at it. What about scenario archetypes? Jim Data gives us these. So scenario archetypes, these are a way that we can actually spawn story, right? We can come up with different forms of story generated by, well, business as usual. That's, what's happening right now. Those Iranians, we're going to bomb the hell out of them. Let's do that to people we don't like, because we're good and we know that good from bad. What about the collapse scenario? That's when everybody's screwed, basically. The world goes to hell, and, if there are any people left at all, we're all back in the Stone Age. A disciplined world is where probably the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, and all other people who really have very strong authoritarian tendencies. The US is heading in that direction at the moment. They discipline us and they control us and they make us behave. So that's the naughty children one. But what about transformation? That's the one that I walked you through just before when I said, we're one human family. Well, we're one cosmic family. What does that mean? So what we have here then is we can plot that and we can say, well, let's look at this type of thing. So over here we've got continuation, which is the orange one, going up, and there's a tipping point, TP, tipping point, and we get limits and discipline. Or if we keep following the business as usual one, we can keep growing. There's still more oil to extract and stuff from the earth. Ultimately, though, we know that there is a decline, that those resources will not last forever. They are finite. But not just that. Those resources and the impact of our extraction have implications for climate and for, the natural ecosystems that sustain human life and so on. Whoa, but this red one over here, I kind of slipped past that, didn't I, sneakily? What about transformation? Well, that's what I'm talking about. Whereas if we actually took relationship seriously, we would end up in potential creating a new kind of world, a new world in which new forms of values and so on are not just practiced and held by you and I individually, but become socially functional and powerful tools. Okay, and we've seen this sort of thing happen before. A very good example that you might be familiar with would be the transition from the classical world to the Christian world. Okay, so where suddenly the classical values and so on were, not erased, but shifted and focused in a Christian way. And so that was, let's say, from the year 500 through to the year 1500 or so. Another great example is the shift from the pre-modern, pre-industrial world to the industrial world that occurred across the planet between, let's say, 1800 and 1950 or 1900 even. So, but we can see that these shifts, these transformative shifts, occur, and they occur when certain critical points are reached. Okay, but that's something that we could talk about at another time. Right now, I'm just trying to offer you some interesting maps. I want to set out a warning here, of course. So the warning is that the familiar, the business as usual, is very comfortable. And people don't want to have to give up their air conditioning or, whatever it might be. Fish and water, right? We're fish and we don't recognize the water we swim in. And of course, none of us can fully. We don't know what we don't know, and there are tools, though, that release our imagination, and this is where I land in this lecture, with the power of our imaginations to engage alternative action. Imagination, when we live it, is something that shapes behavior. In other words, we can become imagination activists. Okay? Just before we leap a little bit further into that kind of stuff, a couple more slides I want to show you. Just so you can get a kind of typology in your mind. You've got pop futures, that's the Tofflers and so on from the 70s, and people who talk about, the singularity, Ray Kurzweil and people like that. Then we got empiricists, that people who, like the people in the IPCC, who are looking at potential scenarios for the future based on climate change statistics and the level of temperature rise globally. They're drawing on empirical stuff. There are people who interpret the world around us. They take a sociological, cultural approach. There's the critical form of futures, which is something that I'm particularly attached to, which is where we look at the world around us and we question the power relationships, who is in and who is out and so on. There's action learning, which of course I think I was talking about when I'm talking about imagination activists and action itself. And of course there are people, and Sahail Ayatollah would be one, who are looking at transformative processes that can bring about deep change. And at one level, that's where I probably ultimately sit, which is why I tend to write papers now like the Navigating the Ruins of the Future. I started off as an academic writing empirical and interpretive stuff. I've drew on the critical philosophical traditions particularly, which I am, as I said, quite attached to. I run workshops and I run around and I dance and I roll on the floor, write poetry and so on. Ultimately, it's all about this transformative, which is, for me, in a sense, that's where we move from futures thinking to the feeling we get when the future opens up. So these forms get, you can look at them through scenario archetypes like the business as usual, the used future, the designed. What futures don't we even want to look at? We don't want to contemplate the end of capitalism, for instance, is all we've ever known. Alternative futures, the colonized future, collapse and transformation. So you'll get a lot of coverage on that from Sahail Ayatollah's little paper on the 6 pillars, which is actually very foundational to much of what I'm talking about here. So, making sense of trends. I'm going to just touch on a few things here now, trends and then scenarios and stuff. So making sense of trends, we can say, look, there are trends that we can map in the 3 horizons type of thing. And I'm throwing tools at you because I know that you've got work to do, assessment work and so on. If you're in the course, of course, you might be listening just for fun. But you know, if you're in the course at Uppsala University, you might want to use this. You want to look at the prevalent trend. This is U.S. hegemony, bombing Iran, and all that sort of stuff now. But we can see that that is going to decline. There's an emerging trend, an in-between trend, which might be not just peace movements, but let's say movements for social inclusion. You see the Pope and people like that, you know, really offering some very sincere and I think thoughtful alternatives to secular dominant power. So we've got that, and then we've got the imagination activists down the bottom who are saying, screw this, we're going to do something different, and we're going to start off in our own backyards. That's a deliberate hook, actually, for the very last slide. So hang on to that. But, you know, what we see is that things that are happening now that are mysterious to us, that are almost indetectable, you know, they emerge over time. We're going to go through a period of transformation. That period of transformation is turbulent, it is difficult, and we can't quite see where we're going. One of the things you have to do with your imagination is you have to trust that if you keep pushing towards inclusion and optimal outcomes, that you end up over here in the green with a better future. One way to do it, of course, is through telling stories. Okay, so my desk is covered with books that tell stories and tell stories in different ways. I've got a book by Orion from the Orion magazine called Earthly Love. I have another one, Vanessa Machado, okay, De Oliveira, Outgrowing Modernity. Then I turn to poetry and the universe in verse with Maria Popov. Then I've got good old Rob Hopkins here, terrific. How to Fall in Love with the Future. They're all storytelling. And so I'm turning more and more, even in my theoretical work, like Time is a Plant, or The History of Silence. These are books I'm just looking around my desk right now. Oh, Plants in Place. So there's so much happening, and there's so much richness that it is hard for me to despair, even when I read the headlines about what's happening now in Iran, let's say. Okay, so cultures are story machines. Okay, and this is from me. The scenario process enables participants to see narrative, the stories we tell as process. It can also enable participants to identify their current narrative context. We are in an imperialist and militaristic world, which has lain dormant in some respects until the last few years, but it is now being actively cultivated again, and it's laying dormant and in our psychic structures, in our imaginations. Okay, so we can identify our narrative structure in the context that we are now. In this way, scenarios help us to distance ourselves from the dominant script and see the world with new eyes. So we've got to release the imagination, heading towards the very last few slides now. So the imagination is a great human asset, but it is shackled by tradition, context, and habit. Okay, we can't imagine what we have not got some access to via direct or indirect experience. The stories we are told, the French Revolution, or the ancient Romans, or Australian colonialism, and the noble white man coming here to Christianize and civilize the savages, and so on, and to tame this wasteland of Australia. It was never a wasteland, it was a fabulous place. Anticipatory imagination plays with context to explore what is in plain view but hidden. Okay, we inhabit what Yuval Harari calls imagined orders. Our world is the product of culture, and culture is shackled to the stories that generally benefit elites. And that is still true, though we've managed to shake the hold of elites to some extent through, let's say, democratic inventions, but the elites have reinvented the democracy to suit their own needs. Futures thinking grows out of the collective intelligence of the room. Who's in the room? Who's in this class right now? Who's listening to this lecture on YouTube or wherever you got it? Okay, we are a collective resource. Okay, and our imaginations and our intelligence are never isolated in our own heads, for instance. It is committed futures thinking to optimal outcomes for those conducting this thinking. Okay, and it also offers us pathways to take action to achieve futures we desire. And it is action that counts. No use sitting in our armchair dreaming up an alternative reality. No, we have to make it, and that's made daily through our choices. Okay, so what about Rob Hopkins? And I mentioned him before, How to Fall in Love with the Future. He's a really great thinker, very entertaining too, tells wonderful stories. He says, look, his little book about how to fall in love with the future is about mental time travel. Okay, and he says, look, when I talk about time travel, I am not talking about flights of fantasy or the absurd. That's not useful in building a positive or livable future. Wild, imaginative, ambitious, yes, this is productive and possible within the limits of the universe. Okay, so that's the plausible and the possible, if we go back to the futures cone, for instance. So he's interested in stretching this, and he does so with a wonderful podcast called From What Is to What If, where he takes people on time travel journeys. I highly recommend it to you. So then, let's get towards the end, summing it all up. So method and madness. There is method, very clear method, to the processes that I've been outlining to you. And I know I've taken on a whirlwind tour, and you're probably going, oh my God, I wish he'd sort of slowed down and talked just about one of those things. There is an absolute massive amount of that we could say about all of these things. And I do say some of this in my own courses that I offer free, online, open access to you all. If you just go and email me, email down the bottom here on each slide. And I'm happy to let you in. And if we get enough people taking one of these free online courses, then we also organise online workshops and tutorials. But, so there's method here for sure. We are not looking for answers. No, answers just choke you, but we're looking for insight, an informed direction, and a sense of agency. Yes, the present is absolutely remarkable, but it can also be different. And that means the future can also be remarkable and different. Optimism and its companions, fun and joy and fun, these are key, I think, to holding our own in the dark times that we inhabit. And what resources do we have to escape the cage of imagined orders? Okay, so the first thing is reading alternative literature, talking to friends, walking in the forests close to you, or if you don't have a forest because you're in a city, go and find a tree and hug it, or watch the birds playing in the street, or whatever it might be. But there are always resources there, and we often forget to pay attention because we are so conditioned to the world we inhabit. Okay, so the invitation is thinking about our human futures now also involves planetary futures. We can't think about human futures without thinking about plants, animals, climate, the whole geology, the hydrology, and so on of the planet. Planetary futures, I think, involves all that makes us who we are. Our inner world, that's our spiritual selves, however you want to define that, microbes and elephants, oceans and stars, galaxies, and photons and quarks, okay? The whole lot. So a few resources for you. The Long Time Project, okay? I love this. There's a link there for it. The great podcast, Screw This, which looks at social innovation around the UK in the last couple of years. So 2020, probably mostly in 2025, maybe 2024. Really just uplifting because you're seeing local people using anticipatory imagination and community to generate alternative futures for themselves and winning, hands down winning. Life becomes much more meaningful and comfortable too, and affordable and all the rest. So I highly recommend that. It's about 6 episodes at the moment. Of course, there's my free self-paced online course, but you need to email me for that because it's by invitation only. So I invite you in, and you can look around. And one great book to turn to, Roman Krishnarik's book, The Good Ancestor. Can't recommend it enough to you all. So, that's pretty much it from me. I know that I've taken you on a whirlwind ride. always happy to talk, always happy to engage with you guys. I will be in Sweden from the end of May through to just after the crazy solstice, and happy to catch up with you there too. Anyway, take care, and I really hope that this gets you thinking and feeling a bit more positive in a day when you might be looking at the news and going, oh my God. Okay, take care and see you.